Okay, so this is the first part of the second module. It's dealing with perception and communication. Communication sort of almost being like a subset of perception, I think, sort of the best way to think of it. So when you're looking at perception, let's go over that first. This gets us back, this sort of segues a little bit back to our theory stuff we were talking about last time. When you look at theory, and remember that theory's purpose is to explain. It's sort of a very short and succinct way of saying, I'm looking at these type of things, I'm not paying attention to those, i.e. the biases. One of the classic sort of players in this was a guy named Emile Durkheim, French, based most of his career in Paris or around Paris. And we'll see him again and again because he was one of the first ones interested in the idea of what commonalities do you see in human experience, in other words, between different groups. And is there a basis for those commonalities? In other words, accidental, is it part of a structure? Not so much with the idea of coming up with laws of human behavior. So he really wasn't into like social evolution, but he was really fascinated with patterns that he saw. So maybe that'd be the best way to phrase it. So I'll go through the first part of this in terms of where he plays into all this. He eventually becomes the head of what would be now sociology, in French, social anthropology, same diff. So we initially see him in Paris, and he's, I guess, teaching or doing something there. And when he was there was when they were building the Eiffel Tower, which is made of iron. When the Eiffel Tower was built in, I'm just going to guess, the 1870s, large iron structures like that were really rare. They built bridges, but the idea of building something like this was right smack dab in the center of a city was really different. And there was a fair amount of, not really so much opposition, but people weren't really sure what was going on. You have to remember, this is also a period of time when what's now called hypnotism is coming into play. There were a lot of different things that were coming into play in this sort of late Victorian period that really that were sort of challenging the traditional ideas of what was going on. And yet medicine and science in general were changing so rapidly. It was sort of like when you woke up in the morning, you're never sure what was actually going to be, quote, true today. It probably was different than yesterday. So sort of like now, things are just changing really, really rapidly. And so in the middle of all this, here goes this big scaffolding, iron structure in the middle of Paris. And occurring at the same time was increasing fascination with new ways of looking at how people function. And one of these was a guy named, I can remember what his first name was, last name was Mesmer. And he was the first one that popularized, though it had existed for a long time before. He's the one that popularizes the idea of mesmerism, which we know, of course, if you think about it, his name still exists in something that's mesmerizing. And of course, that's hypnotism. So he's the one that popularizes this, has big sort of like stage shows, does a bunch of stuff with this, and is freaking the absolute crap out of everyone with the idea that you can actually manipulate people's minds, which apparently hadn't occurred to people. That was actually going on for thousands of years before, but all of a sudden this is making it bang right in the urban heart of the modern intellectual European world in the late 19th century. So what happens is the Eiffel Tower is going up, for some reason sort of an urban legend starts up, urban folklore starts up, that the metal, i.e. the iron in the Eiffel Tower, actually acts like an antenna, or I don't know what you want to call it, I guess an antenna. And what it's doing is it's whispering to susceptible people, because by the time they had the sucker just partially built, people were already climbing up there and throwing themselves off to commit suicide. So there's this whole pattern of suicides happening in the structure while it's being built. And very quickly, sort of a package occurs that becomes real popularized in the press, that the iron structure of the Eiffel Tower actually is literally sort of mesmerizing or sucking people into it and whispering to them, come up here and jump. And so this was becoming a real issue to the extent that there were some discussions about tearing it down or stopping construction of it just to save the public health. And Durkheim, who's there at the time, becomes absolutely fascinated initially in, was it actually happening? And very quickly comes to the conclusion, it's just an iron structure, ain't nothing going on there. But he's also fascinated in this whole issue of sort of initially, I think probably also mesmerism. But he comes out of all this, becomes very interested in perception, because when you get into this is people standing around in Paris, drinking a espresso or something like that, smoking a little French cigarette, and looking at the structure and making all these statements about it and then what they see. So Durkheim in this goes into a whole mess of directions. We'll see this in terms of his definition of religion, which we still use. We'll see this in terms of his definitions of some other concepts. But the key one for this is the idea that he comes up with the realization that when people are talking about this stuff, they have a common point of discussion. You could, if you were a newspaper editor, you could print an article about the structure mesmerizing people and bringing them up so they jump off, and the population could read that and understand what the hell you were talking about. And yet the thing had never happened before. Mesmerism had never been popularized before. The Eiffel Tower had never been built before. Didn't even have iron structures before. So you couldn't say that this had been around for a while and people knew what was going on. This was something that was brand new, and yet there was a very quickly sort of a common shared perception, both of what it is and sort of, I don't know if you want to call it risk, attached to it. So Durkheim became absolutely fascinated with this whole idea of what was perception and how could perception be shared between large groups of people who had never had contact with each other, who didn't have they didn't all go to the same school. It was very hard to figure out how they could all talk about this stuff and all understand what each other were talking about. He came to the conclusion, this is sort of a key part of Durkheim's studies and everything, that in the human species, to operate effectively in groups, there has to be a certain level of sort of shared perception. And what he did is he said that it isn't necessarily true between totally different groups, but within each group, I will just call them culture, you're going to find that they classify their world in a commonly shared set of boxes or packages, or if you want to have in modern context, folders. And that allows the group to then talk about things that they haven't seen, to talk about things that don't exist, and yet share the understanding of what that is. So he was the first one to sort of argue that the way we see the world around us isn't just sort of a pile of stuff. It's actually organized, and it's organized into sort of discrete packages. He said what the huge striking difference was is that if you went from one culture to another culture, it wasn't that it was organized, it was the organization was different. The sense of what was in each box was different, had a different label to it, had a different set of things in it. So what he came to the conclusion was, on one hand, in the human species, we organize our world around us, and we organize into packages. And within a culture, there's a fairly shared acceptance of what most, if not a lot of those packages or boxes are. Between cultures, not so much, in some cases, not really much at all. And so he was the first one to sort of grasp and define this idea of what we now call sort of universal classification. That people have sort of an innate need to make sense of the world around them, which we'll see again, he also comes up when he talks about religion. And in doing so, they organize things in a structure that makes logical sense to them. Now you have to remember there's enormous difference between the word logic and the word rational. In anthropology, very specifically, logic means that if you ask someone, why do you think this? They can give you at least a partial explanation. In other words, they're just not taking it, not critically, they understand something about it. Rationality means that you see things in a very much sort of data-driven, structured framework, which of course isn't necessarily true of logic. So one thing we're going to see during this semester is there's a lot of stuff that's logical if you look at the people inside of the group that isn't necessarily rational to people outside of the group. And this is one of the areas that, ethnocentrism is such a huge player, is this idea that some groups, for example, Americans, like to see the world or pretend they see the world rational ways and they expect other people to. So when those other groups act in other ways, we oftentimes will say, oh, they're being irrational about that, which of course just means they're being non-rational, which one is not quite accurate, and two, so why is irrational worse than rational? And a lot of the stuff that Americans would argue is rational is actually just a form of logic. So it's important to make a distinction between things that are logical and things that are rational. Every group has a logic to how they see things and a structure to it, and fits into Durkheim's classification system for that group. Can it be exported? No, in many cases not. Somewhere during the semester, we're going to see a classic example would be, for example, Hawaiian views of the world around them and sort of what you might call Anglo-American views of the world around them, which are two entirely separate systems of classification that don't really have a lot in common. And of course, ended up being a huge amount of confusion in the 21st century when these groups have to coexist and co-decide what they want to do with the world around them. Second concept that I actually got into, I think, sort of in passing last week, this is the idea of worldview. And again, just to reiterate, because I think I mentioned this before, when you're talking about worldview, worldview is always from the standpoint of an ego, in other words, an individual. Everyone's worldview starts with them, and it's sort of like a bullseye or a set of radiating ripples. So anyone's worldview is going to be at some point or another different from everyone else's because they have a different, slightly different world experience. They come from a different standpoint, whatever it is. Having said that, a large part of worldview, which ties into Durkheim's classifications, is based on common shared perceptions of the world around them. So when you go and interact with someone, especially from a different society or even different ethnic group, it's very, very important to try to get some grasp of what the worldview is. And this is one of the areas where anthropology is really handy, because if an anthropologist is providing a decent translation of another group to someone from outside, that means that outsider can actually look at that work and get some sense of what the worldview is to insiders. So when they go to that place, they're a little less, caught by surprise or totally lost when someone in that other group interacts in a way that's logical but makes no sense to the outsider per se. So worldview is an enormous part of what most ethnographies are, which is the work that anthropologists do, is in some way or another eliciting parts of someone's worldview. Oftentimes, sort of those boxes that I mentioned, Durkheim's boxes, the term you hear a lot for those now is collective representations, which when you think about is one of those handy, sort of sets of words, which means exactly, it's really good, the word is the definition. Collective meaning group, representations would be sort of the images or things that you put in that collective box. So think of that as the top whole list of boxes, and from group to group you'd have to figure out what this set of collective representations is for X versus that or the other thing. For example, the idea of male and female, or gender roles and gender, and in general, all that would vary tremendously from group to group, culture to culture. But within each one, there's a fairly clear discussion of what are the collective representations. Now again, remember, this all gets even more complicated when you remember cultures change over time. So if you look at Japanese society, which we'll look at again in a second, if you look at Japanese society, 100 years ago, the collective representation of the gender roles of men and women was pretty clear, and there wasn't a lot of diversity in it. If you look at those same representations in 2020, Japanese society is going through an enormous amount of change, and there's a lot of disagreement, especially between men and women, about what those gender roles are and how they've changed and what they should be in the future. So collective representations on one hand can be, one of these boxes, but that doesn't mean it's static in the sense that everything in the box has always been there and everything in the box is always going to be there. Like everything else in culture, they're subject to change, and oftentimes can be very radical and very short term, and oftentimes very distressing to the people in the group. When all of a sudden these changes are occurring, they're not sure what's in the box anymore, for example. The process by which people acquire these perceptual boxes or these filters or whatever analogy you want to use would be, depending on if you're in anthropology or sociology, is what we call socialization or enculturation. We tend to use socialization most because that allows you to talk about subgroups like ethnicity and such also. So socialization is the process in which by someone is brought up to understand the group, the culture, the values and attitudes that make up that population. And this is why if you go somewhere else, we'll say that one of you guys goes off to study in, trying to think of someplace different, Helsinki, Finland. So you're going to go study in Finland. You're going to teach, I don't know, you're going to teach English there for a year. I have no idea why you would, but whatever. So you're going to go to Finland. You've never been to Finland. Have no idea how Finns operate. So you grab a little bit of something, get a little white guidebook, and try to know how you do things there. But you're pretty much entirely at a loss. When you go there, if you're going to try to embed yourself in Finnish society, you're going to be like a 3-year-old kid. You're going to be walking around asking why all the time because nothing's going to make a lot of sense to you, but you want to understand it. And hopefully you'll find someone, we usually call these the informers, who actually, they're not informers on police stats, but what they are is more accurately they're guides. They're the ones that are going to take you under their wing and try to sort of explain and help you through the learning process of becoming a member of the group, or at least understanding the group. The process of learning how to be part of a group is socialization. This has always been a huge part of anthropology and sociology, but on the other hand, there's always been this really sort of confusing part of it. It's never been possible, or no one's ever figured out exactly how to figure out how kids, for example, become socialized to their world. We know kids do it at a very, very young age. You can watch it with, nieces and nephews, family members you have that are really little. Very quickly, they pick up a whole mess of attitudes, values, and stuff that are reflective of the population around, especially their parents, siblings, etc. But none of that's formalized. Very rarely does someone sit them down and tell them something. So we're not really sure how socialization occurs with kids. We're really sure how it occurs when you're an adult. And there's a ton of different types of works on this. One of the best would actually be, hang on a second, see if I can grab it. This fascinating work that was done by this lady. It's on one hand a novel, on the other hand, it's really good anthropology. She was teaching in Japan. She wrote this sort of murder mystery, with the main character being, I think, sort of a version of herself. I'll put it in some sort of a note. But her name's Sarah Backer, and the book is American Fuji. And what it is basically the book is basically a discussion of what it's like to be an American in Japan teaching, and how when you become socialized in Japanese society, if you're there for a period of time, you realize that you're sort of lost some of your socialization in American society where you came from. This is a real common problem that anthropologists faced. If I go back out to East Maui and I'm over there for, maybe 6 months or a year, I'll get reattached, or hopefully, sort of reacclimated to being part of the Kanayo community. And in that process, I remember how to do things over there, which is radically different than here, because it's very much engaged in sort of a sort of part Hawaiian ethos and worldview. And so to function effectively in that group, I have to sort of return to, at least in part, being a sort of surrogate member of that group. Now, what that's going to mean is for the first couple of, usually about a month or two, I'm going to have a hard time. Because if you get used to living here, there's a whole different things, like, for example, time are totally different. The way that you interact with people is totally different. So it's gonna take a while for me to make the actual adjustment to going back to that world. Now the irony is, we'll say that I'm over there for 9 months, then I come back here because I got to go teach next year, we'll say. What's going to happen is, and again, you think about this, if I come back here, when I reach Honolulu and I come back to Oahu, I'm going to find myself in the same situation, because if I've gotten used to being over there and that's a different set of rules, I've got to reacclimate myself to being over here in this set of rules. This is something that anthropologists always face when they do extended field work in a population to become comfortable with. They have a different set of rules and behaviors. You sort of reintegrating yourself into that, and then that makes it very difficult. You've got to go through the same stressful process, and it takes roughly about 6 or 8 weeks when you come back to Honolulu to go back to being a part of this society, or this system. And some of you might face this. If you go away, say you live in Chuuk and you go back to Chuuk in the summer, and you're there, it's going to, for a period of time, if you've lived here, say in Honolulu for a couple of years, there's going to be some parts that are difficult to adjust to, just because they do things very different in Chuuk than they do in Honolulu. But what you're going to find yourself is getting comfortable in that way again, because we'll say it's what you grew up with. And so even though you're more comfortable here because you moved here, and then, that's adapting back to life back there. And then of course we'll say that, 6 months later, bang, you got to come back to Honolulu again, the same process. So socialization in adults is much easier to track, because you can actually have it, okay, it starts on such and such a date. And because you've got adults who can be more introspective in terms of how the changes are occurring, they can actually start to keep track of them. They can actually have that discussion. They can actually, frequently in anthropology, one of the things you almost invariably do is sort of a daily journal. And one of the things you include in that is actually what happened to me today, what problems did I have, how did I deal with that, etc. Now, if you notice now, that's very much within the context of what we call phenomenology, because you're looking at it from the standpoint of the individual dealing with this larger sort of cultural ethos. That's what Backer's book does really, really well. It's a fascinatingly, very, very good discussion of being an American in Japan who's never going to be Japanese. They look different. Japanese are going to treat them as different. So she's become used to being an outsider who's an insider. On the other hand, she finds that she has, even though she's not a full member of the group, that's become sort of a comfortable, understandable commodity. She's socialized to it. And therefore, going back to American society becomes a very difficult emotional, choice to make, which she decides eventually not to sort of re-socialize herself. So when she's interacting with Americans, she sees them as outsiders. And not surprisingly, they see her as being an American, since that's originally what she was. I mean, you'll see this a lot when you go to different parts of the world and you deal with people from different parts of the world. Socialization can be a very, very, very complex thing. And it varies tremendously from individual group to group in terms of how it happens, how much it happens, and what it looks like. But the commonality is that it does happen. So socialization is a really key part of what anthropologists both look at, and it's also what anthropologists experience, because remember, what we do is usually participant observation. If you're going to participate in something, but you're also going to observe those folks, the only way you can participate is by trying to be a member of the group. So, you're going to have this issue of socialization. Now in this process, let me give you an example. I'm not sure if this will show up in the camera, but I'll try it. Okay, here we've got an object. This is a Chinese object. It's a flat disc made of bronze. It's got two sides, one that's got a very fancy set of engravings or, sort of cast artwork. On the other side is a flat surface. Now, from a perceptual standpoint, this is fairly heavy. This is actually a, recent knockoff, eBay-based copy of a Chinese mirror. So on one hand, this is a copy of a pretty much Han Dynasty, maybe Qin or late Zhou dynasty. So this is basically, if it was an original, this would be about 2,000 to 2,500 years old. And it's a little bit smaller, it'd be a little bit larger originally. So this is actually a mirror. So this side was decorative. It would have had a hole in here, and you would have held this with like a silk tassel or something like that. And this side would be the mirror side. And it's obviously not a very good mirror now. But what you do is if you cover this with oil, when you cover this with oil, you're going to, hang on a second, wait. There. When you cover this with oil, what's going to happen is that it's going to increase the reflective surface. And if I polish this better, you would then be a mirror. You can actually see yourself in it. So on here, on one hand, from a sort of the idea of rational reality, here you've got a physical object that is what it is, okay, and it serves a functional purpose. It's a mirror. Now, on one hand, the Chinese understood it was a mirror. After all, they made the damn thing. On the other hand, they didn't see it in the way that we see it in the modern context. They saw this mirrored surface. When you look at it and you see a reflection, the Chinese view is that you weren't seeing yourself. You were seeing another version of yourself. So the person in the mirror was not the person, it was not the reflection of, for example, me. It's actually something that's partially me and partially something else. And more importantly, it's also seen as being somewhere else. So the thing on the mirror wasn't seen as being a reflection. The thing on the mirror was seen as being somewhere like over here. Now, what happens very quickly is, this is both with the Chinese and other groups, not surprisingly, these things become seen as being magical. In the sense that you do ritual practices where you actually use the mirror as a form of like meditation to go and talk to the things on the other side. As we'll see later when you get into religion, this is sort of things on the other side of the screen. So things that are not part of our normal world could exist on the other side of the mirror, which you can see through the doorway, which is the reflection. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, the interesting thing is what you find is, since these were very hard to do, it's very hard to cast one of these. And if you actually look at the originals, I've seen a couple of the originals in the Shanxi Museum where there's silver, they're covered in a silver coating. They are really good mirrors. But because of the casting process, there's always, if you look at this, you guys probably can't see, but it's not perfectly flat. So it's always sort of like those fun houses mirrors. And when you look at stuff in here, the reflection's a little bit distorted, almost invariably. And so not surprisingly, because it's a little distorted, you know, and you remember, you don't have any other normal way to see your face except maybe in water, which is also going to be distorted. So people weren't used to seeing themselves. And so when they see these mirrored images, they tended to think, well, maybe that's not really me. That's really sort of something that's sort of part of me, but it's also something different. These become very important ritual fixtures. In fact, traditionally, Chinese emperors and for example, still the imperial family in Japan, one of the three sacred objects, or I think it's three sacred objects the imperial family has in their possession that defines them as being the emperor and his family, is a Chinese mirror. Because that was seen as having such magical properties that whoever was using it could talk to particular gods, or especially Amaterasu, the goddess who is the founder of the Chinese dynasty, or Japanese dynasty. So the mirrors weren't seen as mirrors. The mirrors were on one hand status symbols. These were incredibly expensive and you had to have all sorts of ritual powers to be able to use them. So having one of these things set a bunch to almost everyone who couldn't use one of these for fear that something would happen to them. Secondly, is they also become ritual ways to talk about things that don't exist in our visible world. So in that context, what you have is the mirror itself, perceptually, becomes a very complicated, very sort of iconic ritual object to those societies. Outside of them, it's just a mirror. Now, there's nothing wrong with seeing it just as a mirror. There's nothing wrong with seeing it in, say, a Japanese or Chinese way. It's the same physical object. But this is where this idea of perception becomes key. We perceive the world around us. How we perceive the world around us shapes how we interact with the world around us. So the choices we make to deal with stuff is based on the perception we have. So perception, it's a sign on my door, perception drives reality. And what that also means is that different groups, different individuals that perceive things in different ways are going to have, to a certain extent, different realities. They might exist in the same physical reality, but what they choose to interact with that, how they choose to deal with it, the choices they make are going to be shaped on their perception of how they see the world around us. So if you want to, everyone is based in reality, but our perception shapes how much and how we interact with it. And this then makes a lot of stuff that you see in terms of how people deal with the world and the choices they make a lot more sense, if you want to think of it that way, if you understand this idea that perception is the key. Reality in the sense of a physical book or a bronze object are relatively minor compared to the perception of what you make of it, because that's going to shape how you choose to act with it, not the object itself. The object doesn't define the action. The action, to a certain extent, just defines it. If you don't think this is anything, then it just becomes a paperweight. The object hasn't changed. It's your view of what the object is. So that's a really, really key part of all this. And that's key to both this idea of perception, representations, but also socialization, because that's the process by which you learn your perceptual filters. You acquire your perceptual filters through your interactions with others and picking up from them how to understand and make sense of the world around you and the parts that are important and the things that aren't important. Last part of this, just don't do this as an assignment, just sort of mull it over in your head. Try to think of things in your perceptual worldview that would possibly agitate other members. We'll say other members of the class if we were to share this in class. We're not going to, but you just sort of think of it that way. And then, of course, in that, you might also go back and think of examples where other people have shared stuff with you that sort of freaked you out. My particular background means, among other things, we talk to spirits. The idea that the dead people are gone is not part of my background. In my background, the dead still interact with the living. So, you can talk to people that are not physically with us anymore. Other folks find that that just freaks the hell out of them. I don't particularly care because I don't, that's their issue, not mine. But in my perception, the world's a very complicated place that just doesn't include visibly physical people. It includes other stuff too. So that's just my personal example of all that. And that's just typical of all these. And it's the most important part is when you go to another group. This becomes a huge part of ethnocentrism, is not understanding that other people's perceptual worlds are different. You don't have to necessarily understand what their perceptual world is, but you have to understand that your perceptual world isn't the only one. Then you're going to have a lot easier time interacting with other folks and sort of making sense of them if you don't sort of prejudge or make assumptions that their perceptual world and yours are, like simpatico or something like that. Okay. I think that was it. Oh yeah. A couple of folks had asked, oh yeah, the reaction papers. Don't get real complicated with the reaction papers, just react to the video. I'm not asking for some deeper, deep multi-page analysis. I just want you, make sure you read the questions before you watch the video, so that you have, it makes sense why I'm making you watch the video. The Hatsune Miku one should have been a perfect case in point. I think that was it. I don't remember anything else that was coming up. If I see comments that people make, I'll try to bring them up. Oh yeah. A couple of people pointed out that it becomes sort of difficult sometimes to understand the difference between culture and ethnicity. Do try to keep those in. They're really, really important. And always remember that ethnicity requires those two parts to it. It isn't just what you think. If you identify with a particular group, it's that members of that group accept you as the group. That's ethnicity, because you'll frequently find in the press and even in sort of the general public, especially in the United States, especially nowadays, ethnicity becomes a much more, not only politically laden term, but it's oftentimes used in a bunch of very, very different ways, none of which are particularly accurate, and in many cases just lead to even more confusion. So when you're looking at ethnicity, it's very simple in that it requires those two parts. But the other stuff that you see, especially in sort of the general popular press and such, that's what they're just talking about, a group, if you want to think of it that way. There's nothing wrong with that, but the idea that ethnicity can be given formal structure, and it's the same place, all the time. That's part of the popular view, but it's not part of the anthropological view, as it were. So I guess that's it. Again, if you have any questions or comments or stuff, be sure and just send me an email. And as I remember, I'll try to throw them in at the end of the presentations. Okay, so with that, we're out of this one.